Not to oversimplify things and tell you stuff that's obvious, but just for emphasis and as an explanation for what the next few minutes are all about, here's the premise. The places we build can be wonderful, but the places are built by and populated by people. And it's the character of the people and the geography of the place that dictates what's built here. Now, for instance, there are very few bridges in the middle of the Sahara Desert, but we kind of need them on the coast. And you take the combination of the people who are here and the places that they've deemed necessary to build, and the culture of the area starts to emerge. Now, the culture comes from the people and is reflected in the place. So where'd the people get all this culture to begin with? Well, it came with them, through their family values and beliefs, their education and sense of community, and a lot more, but you get the idea. And you put it all together, and it plays like a Mozart symphony. That's what we see in the grand view, the culture of the coast. But there are many lines of harmony in that completed symphony. Jambalaya, Mardi Gras, Hanukkah, Christmas, and 1,000 other things that we don't pay that much attention to all came here with people who are here. We've all left our mark, our place at the table, our traditions. We've asked some representative people to tell us about themselves, where they came from. Not where they came from, most of them are from the coast, but where their families came from. And we'll start with a couple that are obviously in the order in which they arrived, and then after that it kind of gets fuzzy because so many folks came here at the same time. But to begin with, here's how the coast coasted to a start. In uncharted time in the past, several thousand years ago, let's put it, because the specific date changes from study to study and expert to expert, but Native Americans arrived on the Mississippi Gulf Coast after a long migration spanning another undetermined expanse of time.
They lived simple lives. They were hunters, fishermen. They gathered. They even raised crops. Pascagoula, Capinan, Biloxi, Tunica, they were here along the rivers, and they all just traveled to each villages, and they traded with each other, hunted together, and traveled, and are married.
From the Native Americans, today we have the names for many of the coast rivers and towns, lots of our lore, and the backdrop upon which the rest of the culture of the coast has been built. And the Native Americans, in a sense, were the first examples of coast hospitality.
And when D'Iberville came in, they encountered them, and they said they were some of the most friendly people that they've ever encountered because they were very open, come up and shook hands with them and wanted to relate with them the best that they could.
So what became of the Pascagoulas and Biloxis and Mobiles? Did they just vanish? No. Partly, they are we. And we are they.
And one of the Frenchmen, Jean-Baptiste Boudreau de Gravelines, he settled into the area. He married to the tribe, to the chief's daughter, the great chief's daughter, and they had 2 children, and that's where we descend from, is from his 2 children.
And that brings us to the French, the first Europeans to settle on the coast, and the first specific dates we have in our textbooks.
When Pierre Le d'Iberville arrived here in 1699, he not only had French troops from France, but he also had his loyal French Canadians, since he was Canadian born. And that was an important aspect of what he was doing, to have somebody who was loyal to him. And of course, later on, we find that the Cajun people arrive. And when they arrive, you have another influx of some different type of culture, but French culture, that arrives at the same time. Well, when you're looking at the colonial portion, we always had that tie with Mobile and New Orleans. As time went along, we were tied more to Louisiana, to New Orleans. And that influence, that French cultural influence, remained firm on the Mississippi Gulf Coast until we start seeing the beginnings of the tourism developing in the 1850s, and also the development of the seafood industry in the 1880s. So the influences are totally French up to that point in houses, whether you call it a Creole house or the various structures that were referred to as Southern cultural houses. They are all based on the French, in particular the galleries or the porches. The wraparound galleries are typically French. Any gallery that covers most of the house is typically French influences. Once they arrived here, you had local French, and we talked just about that cultural mix. You had local French already here. They got together with the Cajun French, and they began to talk in 1931 about developing a society. In fact, one of the gentlemen from North Biloxi, who was part of the colonial French, recommended that they use the Fleur de Lis as the name of the society because it was in line with the Bourbon Kings. So they accepted that, and they became the Fleur de Lis Society, or the French Club as it's commonly called today.
The coast became a hotspot for tourists, especially from New Orleans by the 1850s. And when you have people coming to a hotspot, it turns into a melting pot. But there are several groups of immigrants who've managed to at least keep a cultural identity down through the years while melting in.
In 1881, Lazaro Lopez and William Ducate, William Dunbar, who was the other one, William Elmer, and Mr. Maycock started the first seafood factory on the coast. And there used to be a historic marker, but I think Katrina knocked it out, but it was pretty much located where the back end, the receiving end of the IP Casino is. They did a lot of business with the company in Baltimore because that was another major seafood port.
My grandfather came here at the turn of the century to work in the seafood industry. He came over here from the island of Brač, Croatia, which is off the city of Split, on what we call the Dalmatian coast, like the dog, Dalmatia. His uncle had arrived in Biloxi about 3 years earlier. He arrived in New Orleans, jumped ship, came to Biloxi, and went to work in one of the seafood factories where the seafood industry was booming at the time. And one of the owners of the factory, Mr. Laz Lopez, noticed his work habits and said, "You're a great worker. I'd like to get more people like you." He said, "Well, I can arrange that." Called back for some of his nephews and cousins, and my grandfather was one of 4 people that came over here in 1903. From there, he worked in the factories, calling his wife, calling his cousins, and others came behind him to work in the seafood factory. And that's how the Croatians came to Biloxi as part of the booming seafood industry at the time.
My grandfather was born in 1869 in Massachusetts, and he migrated down here to the coast. He loved the water and he loved fishing. He came to Mississippi City first and was working in the shipyard in Mississippi City and decided he wanted to run a boat. That's where his true love was. So he came over to Biloxi and he met Mary Ella Bennett and married her, my grandmother, and started working for Lowell Desport as a shrimper. They had 6 boys and 6 girls. And of course the boys worked on the boat with him quite a bit. And he wanted, if weather was bad, he would take the family and go to the boat. He didn't want to stay on land when it was bad weather. He loved the water, period.
Edward Ned O'Keefe was born in Tipperary County, Ireland in 1815, and he and his sister were 2 of those youngsters that their parents told them, "You need to go find a better life." And they got on that boat, and they ultimately arrived in the port of New Orleans, and where they settled over there for a year or 2, and then they ultimately made their way, migrated over to Ocean Springs here. But Ned, was a teamster, and he had horses and wagons, and most funeral home businesses evolved out of either someone that had a horse and a wagon, or somebody who might have had a cabinetry shop who would build a coffin for a decedent. But if there was an individual that had a wagon and a horse, if somebody passed away, oftentimes they'd be put on the wagon and be carried out to the cemetery, and that's what Ned did.
My father was Irish, and he came here in 42, I think, at Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, And we didn't have, I think, a big influx of Irish people like we did with the French and the Croatians.
But big influx, small influx, or even individually. Here's some more of our friends who are in the mix.
America is a good Italian name. Well, I came from Italy in 1962 on the Leonardo da Vinci liner, I moved here. I bought a different home right here on the Gulf Coast, and I'm in the retirement mode, and I like to help the Italian cultures because I have 40 years of experience with the Italian American communities. At one point, the society was going kind of slowing down because its members, they become elder and things like that. Well, I want to bring more vitality in the society, more young people, the young generation into the club. So l'unione fa la forza. It means the strength it's within us with the generation.
We get together at least once a month, and thanks to Joe, we have a number of activities now that pull us together, and Italians love to eat. So that's what the meetings we have always involve some kind of eating. Yeah.
Well, the Germans, most of the Germans on the coast came through New Orleans, of course, and they came for a variety of reasons. One of the biggest reasons was in the early 1800s, the German Empire, as it was known, actually the German Holy Roman Empire, was broken up by Napoleon, and it broke up into a number of principalities. And as they would fight each other, and of course the continuing border disputes with France, a lot of them left Germany for the simple reason they didn't want to fight in the wars all the time. And yet, for example, you had the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, which changed hands several times over the course of a couple hundred years between the French and the Germans. On both sides of my family, I have relatives, last name Michel. On my mother's side of the family, they say Michael. Good German pronunciation. On my father's side of the family, also German, they say Michel. So it depends on who was in charge, I guess, at the time, the French or the Germans. But a lot of them came into New Orleans, as my family did, and a lot of it had to do with trying to escape the wars that ravaged and went through the various principalities of what was formerly the German Empire.
Jewish history goes much further back. I think most people would be really surprised at the depth and the breadth of Jewish history on the Mississippi Gulf Coast.
Tell me about it.
Well, the earliest documentation I can find is from the John Law settlement in 1720. When the ships arrived, they described the settlers as French, Germans, and Jews. It's right there in the log. And the leader, sort of the local manager of that settlement, was a man by the name of Elias Stulthaus, and he's described as a Jew from the Rhineland. Later we see Jewish presence again. In 1853, we have a deed to a cemetery in Biloxi called Hebrew Rest. The local trustee was a man by the name of Samuel Friedlander from New Orleans that came over. He lived in the house that's now Mary Mahoney's. That was his home back in the early 1850s. We've got records of Rabbi Alfred Moses from Mobile coming over during World War I to service the Navy soldiers at the Gulfport training facility. And that's the first documentation I can find of a Jewish service held in Biloxi. That was at the Elks Club. They apparently rented the ballroom upstairs, and the little article in the Herald said that he gave a sermon and to a packed house. Everybody was interested to hear what he had to say. He was quite an orator, apparently.
Well, the Greeks came in the early 20s and 30s, the early Greeks here on the Gulf Coast, and they spread out. New Orleans is the first church that was established 150 years ago, the Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Cathedral. Then we have the Mobile Church, Annunciation Greek Church, and then ours in the middle that was established. Theirs is 100 years in Mobile. Ours is 50 years here on the coast. And the families that came over from Greece, there was not a church here at the time when they came over. Most of them came from an economic standpoint, and they were all good cooks or restaurateurs, so they owned a lot of restaurants on the coast. The hurricanes destroyed several of them, and they rebuilt. But there was never a church for them to go to, so they took a train over to New Orleans, most of them did. And then we had the priest over there, Father Gaines, come over here, and he would conduct services for the Greeks in some of the local homes or in some of the other churches, like St. Peter's by the Sea, since there wasn't one. Once we got our church, well, then the families of the early Greeks started becoming involved, and they're the ones that really got this church going. The composition has changed over the 50 years. It's been mostly Greek from the early years. And then as you move into the 21st century, the church is now becoming a melting pot of Eastern Orthodox cultures and countries. And a lot of converts who were not happy with their other religions have now become Orthodox and baptized into the faith.
We opened a few restaurants back in Louisiana, seafood and prime steaks. And then I added that Lebanese and Greek to it, you know. And they don't have a lot of Lebanese people like anywhere else. And then whenever I open up, everybody telling me, what you doing down here was Lebanese cuisine. And in my mind, I said, if the people come and try my food, they're gonna come back because we got good food.
Another of our groups has been here from colonial times, but had no set date of immigration, because oftentimes they were brought by others, and oftentimes as enslaved people until after the Civil War, African Americans.
Now my grandparents, my grandfather and my grandmother, they were farmers, and they were in George County. My grandfather farmed and of course had livestock and all of those things. And he and my grandmother, they reared 17 children, but my grandmother, she bore 15, and she was a midwife back in the day. She delivered a lot of her grandchildren. So they really instilled into their children, you know, work ethic, family values. My dad had a brother who, Reverend A.A. Dickey, he was a pastor here on the coast, but before he started preaching, he was a milkman, and he came to live with his brother, and he went to high school at Nichols High School here in Biloxi, and he was also involved in the wade-ins and a lot of the civil rights movements with Dr. Gilbert Mason, when, you know, blacks were not allowed on the beaches. We can look back and thank God, you know, how he brought us through with leaders like Dr. Mason and my father and others who paved the way for persons like me. I'm a graduate of the University of Southern Mississippi in Hattiesburg, and had they not gone through the civil rights era, that would have been something that I would have not been able to attend. And my brother, he's a graduate of Ole Miss, and you know about the James Meredith and all of that. So, you know, had it not been for the civil rights era, you know, we wouldn't have been able to matriculate at white universities here in Mississippi and to earn degrees.
Another couple of groups of people who came to the coast you may not readily associate with the area, but they have descendants here and landmarks here: the Danes and the Finns.
Both my grandmothers were immigrants. My grandmother, Jensina, came in 1887 as a bride, and they were in California. Then they moved to Donavang, Texas, a Danish community in Texas, then to Mississippi. The cutover timberland, all this land, after the sawmills played out, it was this land through realtors and bankers was advertised in immigrant newspapers as good farmland, cut over farmland. There's no timber to clear, it's cleared. Come by some acreage and kind of the Los Angeles of the South, where you could have a long growing season. But this was during the Depression, 1929, 1930. This was during the Dust Bowl. The advertisements were very enticing. Come to this wonderful place where it's a long growing season. So the property was sold as Granley Investment Corporation, named by an Iowa banker who was a Danish banker, Hans Madsen, and his daughter Alma. And she was a realtor,
And so that's where it began. And they sold to all these immigrant families who needed a better place, who had lost things. We had folk dances here. We had a monthly party for everybody who had a birthday that month, which as a little girl growing up, I have vivid memories of those parties, especially the August one, because that was my birthday month. And I remember everybody who had a birthday in August because of that. For the Danish families, the Christmas tree was put up on Christmas Eve day. And you didn't get to see the tree decorated until Christmas Eve after dinner. And then we had our celebration. And the first thing we always did from tiny little girl up is hold hands and go, and the tree was in the middle of the room. And we would go around the tree singing. And we do this now still every Christmas here. And go around and circle it, and we have sometimes 4 or 5 circles around the tree. There's so many people.
Gideon Lane, who was the manager of the Finnish Gulf Coast Land Company, came here in 1899, and then these other 2 gentlemen followed in 1901. They put together this pamphlet that gave an overview of the area, the temperatures, the weather, the cattle that could be raised here, the vegetables, fruits, whatnot. And it seems like there were other pamphlets that were similar to this, but in different areas of the country. So I believe they were just trying to entice the Finnish people to these different areas. But majority of them settled up in Michigan and Minnesota and Canada. The weather that they were more used to. But it's a little one-room church. The pews that are there were handmade by the members, and there is a pump organ there that's been there since 1912. So we still use it at Christmas. When we have our Christmas carols.
There's still new people moving to the coast and bringing their culture with them to share with everybody already here. And they also pick what they like of what's already here and use it themselves.
I came to the United States in 2001. I came as a student. I did my master's at the Philadelphia University in Philadelphia. And right about the time when I graduated, September 11 happened. And it was a very, very bad time for the whole country and the world as one. And I couldn't, it was very hard to find a job in the financial sector, especially with a company that would be willing to do transition your paperwork from an F1 student visa to a work visa. My uncle, he sponsored me, and I moved to South Jersey, and I worked with him for 8 years. And then we moved to the coast in 2010. I bought a couple of convenience stores in this area, and we opened the restaurant about 5 years ago because we saw there was no Indian restaurant in this area on the coast. The closest one was either Mobile, which was 60 miles, or New Orleans, which was 60 miles. So we opened this place in 2014. Our kids growing up in this country would have the ties of the Indian culture as well, and the culture they are growing up with. We try to balance both of them out, like we do the Diwali festival, and we do the Navratri, but at the same time, during Christmas, we set up a Christmas tree at a home, and we hide gifts under the tree. We put food out for the reindeers, and so that the kids can understand both the cultures and try to balance it and get good things from both the culture.
And finally, one of the most recent groups of people who have found a home here on the coast are the Vietnamese.
Back in the late 70s, when the fall of Saigon in 1975, that's when the South Vietnamese government fell to the North Vietnamese, which is a communist regime. Most of the Vietnamese left at the time in search for freedom, and many of them immigrated to the United States. And when they got here, they were kind of spread around to different parts of the country. But, and some were most in California, New York, Wisconsin, but eventually the people who move into this area are the people who live on the coast in Vietnam. their primary profession at the time, and still now, is fishing. So naturally, they come to this area because of the climate and the condition similar to what they were experiencing in Vietnam.
I was born in Vietnam in 1967, and life in Vietnam was pretty normal at the time. I went to school and came home one day. My dad had packed all of our belongings onto a bus, and he said that we were moving. As we were playing on the beach, swimming in the water, all of a sudden there was just chaos. We heard people screaming, people running everywhere, and we just did not know what was going on, but my dad knew what was going on. He gathered all of us together, and at that moment, we saw my mom running towards us. She found us on the beach, thanks to my little brother too, who knew where we were. We all grabbed our stuff and went directly to the harbor where all the boats were. One day, we noticed a huge ship with a barge, and everybody started getting onto this barge. We got pulled up onto this bigger ship, and then one day my dad said that we're going to be sponsored by a parish in Rockford, Illinois. And the parish, St. James Catholic Parish, decided to take us in, and we flew over to Rockford, Illinois, and we were taken in by the whole parish. Then we lived there for 4 years, and he connected with some friends in New Orleans. And at the moment he said, you know what, my children are losing their culture and heritage. We were not speaking Vietnamese. We would understand what our parents were saying in Vietnamese, but we would reply in English. And there were not a lot of Vietnamese people around where we were. So he decided to move us all down to New Orleans. So that's how I ended up in New Orleans. And I went to school there at Loyola University. I graduated from there. And then I got a job at WLOX in Biloxi, and that's how I came over to Biloxi, Mississippi. But being here in South Mississippi, being able to be near people that went through the same experiences, have the same background, and can speak the same language, it's wonderful to be able to share that. And here in South Mississippi, we do have vibrant Vietnamese communities, and we do have so many activities that involve families, not just Vietnamese families, but families from across the Gulf Coast.
And that's how our culture grows. Someone brings their best and everybody else adopts it, or even adapts it, as with the case of the Italian hot tamales.
My great-grandparents, they were Mary and Ciro Maniscalco. They were immigrants that came to the United States looking for a better life. My grandfather, he married my grandmother, Angelina. And when my grandparents decided that what they were going to do, the friends that they had was already doing. They were role models. It was a Mexican family, and they had tamales, hot tamales at that. And my grandparents decided they wanted to learn how to make these hot tamales because they were so good. And so my mother, Doris, back in the early days when they were making their tamales, would help my grandparents. And she decided she's going to make those tamales, and had a little small stand built out in the front yard. It was like a box. And she started making those tamales, never dreaming in a million years that over 40 years later, we would still be there carrying on the tradition of my grandparents and my mama making tamales.
And that's how it happens. That's how a collective culture emerges. Everybody brings their customs and their recipes and their beliefs with them, and sooner or later, the best of them, the tastiest of them, the most fun of them, the better for the rest of them, sticks and becomes the collective culture of the area. And the coast is a pool of all of what you've seen in the past few minutes and much more. Family customs, regional customs, ethnic customs from all over have settled here and sifted like sand on the beach into our culture.